Part 3. He talked for weeks after he got back. He and Sophie sat in their small apartment, windows curtained against the world, each trying to find what had been lost. At first she listened, pushing aside her own worries. She tried not to fear who this man was to whom she'd given her life. She tried to be charitable. She waited her turn. It was successful beyond our wildest dreams. He clenched his fists, tried to squeeze the tumbling from his hands. It was perfect. She touched his face with the back of her finger, tracing lightly down over his hard cheek. She wondered now if they would ever get back to where they had been, if the physical passion they shared would ever return, if they could manage to turn their fears into strengths. Yes, it's done with. The finger continued, inviting memories of lost afternoons. It was meant as a consolation, a reintroduction of the gifts they had opened with such pleasure. It's over and done with, and we can start life again, she said. You can forget it now. You think you just snap your fingers, he said, suddenly vicious. She tried to live with the news that had been coming out of Europe these last few months, hoping word might come through somehow from somewhere. There was the slightest possibility. Every morning she hurried to the mail slot at the sound of the letter carrier. Maybe a neighbor from the old quarter or a distant relative would have a word, or something written in her mother's hand. We are safe. We have tracked you down. We are coming to America. But the letter never came. How could it? How could they know where she was? That she had married a German scientist who'd brought her to this foreign city? That she was waiting for them here, alone, with a man she feared she did not know? But still, there was time. Most days she took the number 9 uptown to the Red Cross offices at Broadway and 66th, where hundreds milled about, checking the lists that were being compiled and added to, ever expanding. She was directed to a woman who headed the Austria offices. Information was still incomplete, she said. This is what we have. We are still looking. One day, as she walked back to the bus stop, she saw a young Italian man from her neighborhood. They'd met a year before, when, through her living room window, he'd seen a rash-shaped like butterfly on her face. She waited for him now, and they walked on together. He asked her name and told her his. He had lost people in Europe, he told her. He'd been coming to the Red Cross office since the winter of 1944. His English had improved since their first meeting. There was a class he attended weeknights when he could. Why is this the first time I see you here? She said. I come as often as I can, he said. He gestured to his own face. You are better. It went away. And when will you go back to home? When I find my parents. Yes, I want to go home. Yes, he was 26 years old. He was alone here, but for an uncle. I am alone too, she wanted to say. I am alone. He was the first person other than Anton she had spoken to in days. Do you like your job? She asked. He delivered meat around the city. Meat packer makes good money in New York. Both Anton and Sophie knew that variations of their hushed nightly conversations were repeated countless times throughout the city. Everyone back from Europe or the Far East or Africa with stories of loss and guilt and fortunes changed. Boatloads of veterans were arriving daily down at the ports, carrying with them their pronouncements of faith lost and found, vigorous promises to start anew. But the city had already entered upon one of its greatest eras of forgetfulness, working harder than ever so that the past might quickly disappear. On her way downtown, After she saw Anton off to the new school, she walked in the cool shadows of the buildings that seemed to have sprouted up overnight. Businesses were founded, entire families disembarked from ports, but a cut as deep as this would not heal simply because it had marked an entire generation. The searing pain could not be relieved or even dulled by the knowledge that their wound, or something similar to it, was suffered in common by so many. It burnt there in the darkness, in the light in its own particular way, regardless of the furious rebuilding and the need to look forward and not back, and the legions with which they struggled along. After work, late into the night, Anton told her what he could remember of his time with the Manhattan district. Sometimes he talked about his new position at the new school, where he'd been granted a full professorship. He talked about his ambition, about their finding a way in the world, but most often he returned to his time in Japan. He talked about the old man he'd helped out there, a man so old you could see through his skin, the man with the funny knees. What was his word? Disconcerting. The way they cracked, those strange clicking sounds. He told her they had all worked on the assumption that the killing nature of the bomb was indiscriminate. But it seemed this assumption was false, at least to him. He'd watched this particular old man lean over two small children, one holding the other's hand, and practically heard what he'd been thinking as he wiped the tears from his face. Why not me? I am the old one. It was a country that had been turned inside out, a place where nature had been thrown on its head. He told Sophie about the bent backs, the crooked noses, and rheumy eyes, and knotted fingers still twisting with stubborn old life. He told her about the long blind and the stone deaf who'd stared down over the perfect, healthy bodies of the dead. The very old mourned the very young from the place they no longer wanted to be, a place that had abandoned them, turned to particled dust and irradiated ash and exploded atoms. It fell to them, still alive, to tend to the burnt lungs and melted fingers of the young and healthy. They leaned over crushed kidneys and blind, staring eyes, over medieval scar tissue that every so often reenacted the blast in miniature by bubbling forth in tiny explosions on the skin, somewhere between red and yellow-white, causing shudders to roll down the length of the body. They leaned over crushed spinal columns and burst eyeballs, smashed ribs and ruptured spleens. "But you helped end the war," she said, touching his neck. "You can't forget that." He barely touched her since his return, over a year now. Any contact between them she initiated, and when it came it was merely for comfort and not pleasure. "You must think about the lives you helped save, the men in the invasion force, the fire bombings, all those civilians." He looked at her, his resentment rising. "Please." He took her arm in his hand and brought it away from him, holding it inches from his face and looking at it with the expression of a man examining a scab picked from a dry wound. Her fingers curled, and she turned to cover her tears. He believed she would never understand at what cost the war had been ended. You've convinced yourself of something," he said. "I am suffering. Is that what you think? I know you don't sleep. I hear you. You leave the bed every night. What does this mean? You think about it. It's always in your mind." "It's my work. They pay me to think. How do you think I pay for this here, this place you live in? Do you think this just happens? In America, everything costs money. You don't know that. I want to go to school. I want to learn English. He waved his hand dismissively. She would never grasp the forces behind the events he lived through. He was resolved not to let her pity him or believe that he now regretted the role he had played. He openly admitted that his time with the Manhattan district had been disagreeable. For the first time he had felt fear, but he was back now. This geographical distance had helped provide perspective. It had returned to him a cool head with which the facts might be observed, the necessities involved, the weight of responsibility. These were the things his wife was unable to understand. All the while she'd been here, at this safe distance, sculpting figures cut from the depths of her solitude. While he was away, she'd begun carving small figures in soapstone, make-believe figures, who now populated the apartment. It was like walking into an art gallery when he came home. It took him 3 days to ask what they were. While he was facing the unimaginable in Japan, she'd been getting on with her life, playing like an innocent. He had looked to her for strength. He had needed the memory of their life together to keep him focused. But now, this normal life repulsed him, and he resented her ability to carry on as she had always done. He did not ask about her family, nothing about what she had lost. It was as if the blast had destroyed the ability to see beyond himself. "You're crying," he'd say, annoyed. "Why are you crying?" She had not talked about her family with him, not once. She knew that he was incapable of listening at first, and that she would not be able to coax him with a mention of her own needs. But she had not expected anger. She had not expected impatience. Silence, yes, but not that she would be expected to bear the consequences of his time at the war. The secret, she finally discovered, was to apply herself in the midst of that dead time. Classes began soon after, in the winter of 1946. She looked forward to leaving the apartment every evening. She enrolled in a Brooklyn Central YMCA class, English for Immigrants. The class filled with people like her, some older, others younger. They were everywhere, she discovered. There was a young woman from Vienna. They decided that first day to speak only English together. The Italian man from the Red Cross, the meat delivery man, came in late her second day. She sat beneath a window that looked out over Remsen Street. He wore loose gray corduroy pants, white shirt and tie. His skin was brown, though it was still winter. As he took a seat, he apologized to the teacher and to the class generally for being late. Sophie smiled at him across the rows. But there was no escaping from the black air that seemed to infest the apartment where she lived with Anton. In order to breathe again, she began to shape in her head what she imagined he'd seen. She tried to understand him this way, all that disaster cut and buffed and displayed for her to walk through, look at from various angles, and discover with a lingering touch of the forefinger. Her sculptures began to resemble the turmoil that kept him awake at night. Sometimes, on those quiet nights when she didn't have school, she remembered her childhood, the years before she was put on that train bound for Germany. She had always lived in her imagination, and now, married close to 4 years to a man she did not know, she shaped the image of the old doctor her husband had watched so closely, a stranger he'd met at one of the aid stations. Once he saw him drop an instrument, a scalpel or something of that nature, and as he bent slowly to pick it up with his brittle old knees, had cracked. Disconcerting. Like that, Anton had said. Pop, pop. How do you sculpt a word like that, she wondered. She'd lain on the couch, putting images to the stories he recounted from that time in Hiroshima. She needed to live through what he had seen. Wasn't it a funny thing, he explained one night, a funny thing to notice in a room full of mutilated people, someone's knees cracking. He'd watched with the greatest fascination the manner in which the man held his back as he stooped to pick up the scalpel, stiffly erect, palm open against the spine as he bent. He had seen the old man many times. They almost could have developed a rapport, were it not for the circumstances. He saw him at different workstations as he did his rounds, looking for tasks that would provide him with a sense of charitable accomplishment. Hopefully, this would ease his conscience, moving from one station to the next. Patients died in great numbers in one neighborhood and seemed to reappear in another, like churlish, taunting ghosts. He worked with little sleep. Anyone with any medical training, no matter how old, was expected to mobilize. Most doctors had been killed in the blast. Soon after pinning that screaming girl to the table, Anton had rolled up his sleeves. Sometimes Sophie would leave with Stefano after class and walk over to Rosalinda's, the diner with high ceilings and stools with spinning tops along the counter. On nights when Anton taught a late class at the university, she stayed until closing time, and they drank Coca-Cola and coffee, and he smoked cigarettes while he told her all the things he missed back home and what he would do when he returned. He did not tell her about the sad things, just the good things. She asked him many questions about what it was like in Pescara, where he was born and had grown up. His father was a fisherman. One morning the Germans came to their house and took his family away. Stefano had been in town across the mountains, studying painting at a small school. "You are a painter?" "No. I wanted that. The war ended that. But the war is over. You can go to that school again. If I go back, it will be as my father was. I will fish in the sea." "You paint here now?" "No." He lit another cigarette. "When I got back, I found the house was empty." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. I will find them. I will save enough money to return, and they will be somewhere." They will be somewhere. Sophie had never been south of Graz. They sat in a booth to convince the world around them to disappear, and she pretended they were in Italy and the war had never been. She had an idea of Italy, but she did not know how close or far off the reality was. It was just an idea. There were picture postcards in her head. She pretended that outside the window to her right was a street in Pescara, and that the girl walking past was Stefano's sister on her way up from the harbor, and that all the people around her were also from the village. "Do you live with someone?" she asked, turning. "I stay with my uncle, Faustino. He is 20 years here, the brother of my father. He works like an animal. He works in the sewer. All night he works. City Works Commission." Sophie watched his hands and lips as he smoked and talked. His hands were small and delicate. It was easier to picture him holding a paintbrush than to imagine him gripping a butcher's knife or carrying a side of beef on his shoulder. When he held the cigarette in his mouth, he squinted his eyes and pursed his lips. "I can get lamb for you, very nice cuts." "Thank you." "A delivery goes to De Lucas tomorrow, the butcher outside your window." "Yes, I know. I see you every Tuesday. You're a very skinny girl. You need to eat more." The uncle's apartment was small and cluttered. There were no curtains on any of the windows and no carpet on the floor, but one circular rug in the center of the living room. When you walked into the apartment, a balcony looked over Charles Street, but no photographs or paintings or pictures of any kind were on the walls. He closed the door behind them, removed the scarf from his neck, and took her coat and purse and tossed them onto the brown sofa by the circular rug. He removed his coat. They left their boots at the door. It was a cold January evening, but she still asked if he would open the balcony door. The cold air rolled into the apartment, and he walked into the kitchen and returned with hot tea. He placed it on the small table in the living room, beside a framed photograph of a child. She returned from the balcony and took the picture in her hand. "Who is this? Is this you?" "This is the painter as a young man." "Yes, I am 9 then." "You are a very handsome boy." She took his hand and placed it in hers and returned the picture to the table. He kissed her shoulder and then her neck. It was cold in the room now. When he lifted her hair and kissed the back of her neck, she had goosebumps there, and something went up her spine and a knot tied in her stomach. His mouth was hot, and she smelled the tobacco in his breath and tasted a slight sweetness of animal blood. It was in his hair and on his skin. When she placed his finger in her mouth, she tasted the warm earth smells of his work and the ruddy tobacco flavor. He circled his tongue to the front of her neck, and she released his finger, and she kissed his mouth, and the cold in Uncle Faustino's apartment seemed to evaporate. "Is it okay here?" she asked. He nodded. She slipped out of her blouse and dress and underwear and stood silently before him. She did not lower her head. She looked straight into his eyes and began to undress him and led him into the next room, and they slipped into the bed together. When she returned home that evening, she found the photograph in her purse and hid it behind a stack of books in the storage room off the kitchen.